Good afternoon. I'm Linnell Cady, Director of the Center for the Study of Religion and Conflict, and it's wonderful to have you all here this afternoon for our program with Professor Ira Chernus. This is our Conversations at the Center program, and those of you who know us primarily through our Alternative Vision lecture series know that this is not the same scale. It is a smaller venue, but what's surprising is how many people have showed up for what are usually a more intimate kind of conversation, and it's great to see you, and I'm sure Professor Chernus and this topic are of great interest to you. Professor Chernus, do you want to come up now? Oh, actually, you don't have to, but we're delighted he's here. He's Professor of Religious Studies at the University of Colorado at Boulder. He has been there for a number of years. His training was at Temple University, and he focused primarily on Rabbinic Judaism. But over the years, and actually quite early on, he became very interested in the nuclear weapons, the nuclear atomic bomb movement, anti-nuclear atomic bomb movement, and started to write about these kinds of issues. And then that moved into focusing on issues of war and peace and nonviolence. So he has done a great deal of publications on this topic and has become very interested in questions of the relationship of really American foreign policy and what he calls the American insecurity state, which I'm sure you will hear more about as he speaks. But he has published various books, some on, for example, the Eisenhower administration, as well as the Bush administration. And now he's hard at work on a book on the FDR administration. So we're really delighted he can be here with us today. And the title of his presentation is War Against Evil, the Religious Foundations of U.S. Foreign Policy. So please join me in welcoming Professor Ira Chernus.
Your wristwatch. Thank you. Thanks very much all for being here. I want to make sure I don't keep you here too long, so I borrowed Linnell's watch.
There you go.
And I'm going to remain seated. I hope you don't mind. Everybody hear me okay? If you can't, tell the sound man. I'm sure he will fix it up. So I want to start out today with a quote that you've probably heard before. It says, "As president, my greatest responsibility is the security of the American people. It's the first thing I think about when I wake up in the morning. It's the last thing I think about when I go to sleep at night." Barack Obama says that often. And it's pretty clear what he means, that his greatest responsibility is to protect us against evildoers who would want to harm us simply because we're Americans. And that's widely been assumed to be the president's #1 priority for nearly 3/4 of a century. Since 1941, there's been a general consensus in the United States that our foreign policy should aim, above all, to defend against evil in the world. But that was a very novel idea in 1941. Just a few years earlier, America was still in the grip of a powerful reaction against World War I, with a widespread belief that U.S. participation in World War I had been a profound mistake. So Americans generally felt that no matter what happened in Europe, it posed no serious danger to them because they were protected by 2 vast oceans. In 1935, Christian Century magazine wrote, quote, 99 Americans out of 100 would today regard as an imbecile anyone who might suggest that in the event of another European war, the United States should participate in it. Now, if we go back to 1918, we could see a sizable majority of Americans afraid of and fully committed to a war against foreign evil. We can see that same scene if we go back to 1776, the War of 1812, the Mexican War of 1846, Spanish-American War 1898. So until the 1940s, excuse me, there was a pattern in American foreign policy that the basic assumption was that we would stay at peace, we were safe, but that would be punctuated just occasionally by a perception of evil from abroad that required war. But since the early 1940s, that basic assumption has been dramatically changed. And we've assumed for all the years since World War II, even that evil is always lurking out there somewhere, that we must constantly be on guard and ready to take up the war against evil. So I want to talk today about what was it that changed, that produced this dramatically new narrative for U.S. foreign policy. Again, to make sure the point is clear, up until about 1940, the assumption was generally we're at peace. Occasionally, we must go out to do battle against evil. Since about 1940, the basic assumption in U.S. foreign policy is that we must always be on guard against evil, always militarized, always fighting either a Cold War or a hot war against evil. That's a huge change that occurred around 1940, and that's why I've been working on this book on Franklin D. Roosevelt, because it was under his leadership that that huge change occurred. And it changed first, I think, in the late 1930s among a fairly small group of people that we can call the foreign policy elite. And by that I mean government officials, business leaders, media leaders, editors, pundits, and influential academics who wield the most powerful influence in foreign policy making. Excuse me, let me stop to say some frog has snuck into my throat. I don't know how that happened. And I apologize if I just can't clear my throat, so we'll just have to live with it, okay? Thank you. So, in that elite foreign policy circle in the late 30s, there was a faithful convergence of three ideological traditions. So I want to spend most of my time today talking about those traditions and showing you how each one of those traditions that created this new narrative for American foreign policy of constantly having to be on guard and fighting against evil, each of those three traditions that came together is correlated with a very old and very basic tradition in Christian religion. Now, I don't mean to say that religious belief directly caused people to accept new beliefs about foreign policy. The connection's more subtle. I want to say that religious traditions were broadly disseminated in all sorts of ways in our society and filtered into the discourse and the thinking of secular society. And does everybody have a copy of this handout that I wrote up here? The first of those traditions we call Christian humanism. And it goes back to the time of the Renaissance. To oversimplify a lot, the basic idea is that everybody can learn to be reasonable. Everybody can be educated. And reasonable people will understand that they all need each other's help to live the best lives they can. People have to trade with each other, learn from each other, and help each other. And when they do that, when they're cooperating, living harmoniously, that's peace. They're living in peace. And the wider the network of those peaceful mutual relationships, the better off everyone is. Ideally, it should include everyone in the world. This is a Christian view because it was based on the idea that global peace and harmony is the goal of God's plan for history. And this idea goes back, as I say, to the Renaissance. Now, in the early 20th century, that Christian humanist tradition was revived in a movement called the social gospel here in the United States. But the social gospel movement went further. It said we can use education and rationality and combine it with a Christ-like love for all other people to wipe out sin completely, to move the world toward a perfection of peace and love and justice. And the reason that the social gospel movement could make that move is because they combined Christian humanism with a second very central Christian tradition, going back to biblical times, which I'll call the Messianic tradition, that says that God chooses at any one time one nation, one people, to lead the world toward a state of perfection. And in the United States, well, even going back to colonial times here in North America, right, it had been widely believed that the white American people were God's new Israel, God's chosen people. And this is the foundation of what's commonly called American exceptionalism, that we are an exceptional people because God has chosen us to lead the world to this messianic era of perfect peace and justice and love. So the social gospel movement combined Christian humanism and this biblical messianic tradition to say that here in America, we can be a perfect model of education and rationality to teach the whole world to live together harmoniously and in peace. Now, how does this enter into foreign policy? Well, primarily, coming back to the era of Franklin D. Roosevelt, 1930s, his Secretary of State, Cordell Hull, said, how do we get people to cooperate and live in peace all over the world? He said, again, to oversimplify a bit, not a lot, he said free trade. He said drop all the tariffs, drop all the barriers to trade, let us, especially Americans, right, invest everywhere, gain natural resources from everywhere, give us free access to the resources, the labor markets all over the world, but let all other countries do that too. Of course, they knew that with the United States being the most powerful nation in the world, that would be advantageous to us economically. But from Hull's point of view, he was the Secretary of State for most of FDR's presidency, there was a kind of idealism, a kind of utopian vision that really mirrors the biblical messianic vision. That said, if only all nations could trade with each other openly and freely, the world would live in perfect peace. Do you mind if I wait and entertain questions at the end of?
Just a question, a request for clarification.
Okay.
For those of us who are familiar with this period, you're talking about the elite. Could you just mention some of the names of these leaders that, as you go along, so we can connect it?
Yeah, I mean, at this time, we're obviously talking about Hull as the leader of this movement, and I think without going into detail, because I have limited time here, I'm going to kind of move through a lot of material. I'm going to say that this idea was picked up by many people in Congress, many senators. Henry Luce, the famous publisher of Time magazine, was an exponent of this. There's a big debate among historians about how much Franklin Roosevelt himself really agreed with this. I've looked at this pretty closely. I think Roosevelt basically agreed with Hull. We'll see how, in a few minutes, how Roosevelt had some reservations. But the key point here historically is that as they looked at the British Empire and the rising empires of Germany and Japan, they said those are the big impediments to our vision of a single global capitalist marketplace. And that's really what they wanted. Democratic capitalism and free access to resources, labor, investment all over the world. And their fear was that particularly the Germans and the Japanese would make that impossible. And so they began to build up U.S. military power in the service of this vision of global peace and harmony, which has its roots in the Christian humanist tradition and in the biblical messianic tradition. And they said, well, with the other great powers of the world trying to create these closed trading blocs, British Empire, East Asian co-prosperity sphere of the Germans, the Deutschmark sphere of the Japanese, the Deutschmark sphere of the Germans. So we Americans are the only ones who are idealistic enough to lead the world toward this global democratic capitalist system, and that becomes our mission. And this idea was emerging in the late 1930s. But as I say, Franklin Roosevelt himself was somewhat reluctant to, or let's say not as idealistic as people like Cordell Hull. Because Roosevelt was also influenced by a third tradition, a relatively new way of thinking about foreign policy among American leaders, which again has its roots in a very old and classical and very essential Christian tradition. In foreign policy language, this third tradition is called realism. I always put that in quotes. Because these folks who call themselves realists were taking one particular perspective on the nature of reality, and they were saying, we see reality as it really is. The rest of you are living in a world of illusion. Looking back, I think it's fair to say they were seeing one particular perspective of reality. They kind of stole that word, realism, and captured it for themselves. The basic idea of the political scientist, and here you may have heard of E.E. Earle, very famous Princeton political scientist of the era who was a leader in this movement, and later on Samuel Huntington, and the name another name will come to me later. The basic idea of the realists in political science is to say, look, what do nations want? They want power. That's all they want. They want economic power. They want political power. Nations will always want power, always have, always will, and therefore they will always compete with each other. That's again, for you political scientists, you know I'm incredibly oversimplifying, but in a nutshell, I think it's a fair description. Now here, we can see even more clearly how theology influenced the rise of this realist view of foreign policy, which in the late 1930s, early 40s, was rapidly becoming very dominant in policymaking circles. Because here, we can look at one great theologian, the most influential American theologian of the 20th century, Reinhold Niebuhr. And we can see, and I want to talk about this for a little while now, how Niebuhr's theology gave a theological justification and foundation for this new political view that came to be known as realism. So I want to give you a brief overview of Niebuhr's views as he laid out in his most influential book, as early as 1932, wrote a book called Moral Man and Immoral Society. And this is, shall I say, the story that Niebuhr told. He said, you know, all of us as human beings, every human being, is aware that the universe is infinite. And we, each of us, is a tiny little speck in the infinite universe. He said, quote, the mind recognizes the ego, the self, as an insignificant point amidst the immensities of the world. And he assumed that this humbling realization would bother us, would upset us, might even be unendurable. So he says, in all vital self-consciousness, there's a note of protest against our finiteness. So since we all know we're so insignificant, he says, we look for ways to enlarge ourselves, to make ourselves feel bigger, to aggrandize ourselves so that we can feel more important in this immense universe. And this, he says, is the root of selfish desire. Quote, man's lusts are fed by his imagination, and he will not be satisfied until the universal objectives which the imagination envisages are attained. His protest against finiteness makes the universal character of his imperialism inevitable. So in a sense, we're all imperialists. We're all trying to be bigger than other people. And Niebuhr knew perfectly well that what he was doing was reviving the old Christian idea of original sin, which said, in essence, we all have an innate tendency to do bad things. Here I should stop saying, original sin, it doesn't mean that you can think of a sin that's original that nobody's done before. You know? I assume you can't. All right. What it means is that from your very origin, from the moment you're born, you have innately within you this impulse, this desire to do more, to be more, to aggrandize yourself. You can't help it. It's just part of the human condition because you recognize how insignificant you are in the immensity of the universe. Now, sometimes we imagine getting more for ourselves by getting more than our neighbors, right? But often, we imagine that we can get more for ourselves by joining with our neighbors to get more than some other group. You join with some group to be bigger and better than some other group, right? The larger the group, the more our selfish desires and our imagination come to control us. And because every group is driven to aggrandize itself, it resists compromising with others as much as possible. This is Niebuhr's argument, his theological argument. Quote, he says, the selfishness of human communities must be regarded as an inevitability. Where it is inordinate, it can be checked only by competing assertions of interest. Which is to say that the more powerful have to impose control on the less powerful. Otherwise, we'll just have a war of all against all. Endless chaos. But Niebuhr says the more powerful can control the less powerful only if they're willing to use coercive means, sometimes violent means, in addition to trying to do moral and rational persuasion. He says once we admit the factor of coercion as ethically justified, coercion is the only way to keep order in society. He says, though we concede it's always morally dangerous, we cannot draw any line of demarcation between violent and nonviolent coercion. So what he says is sometimes the people in control are going to have to use violence. And you can't predict. There's no rules to say when violence is okay. You just got to choose by the situation. Now, of course, the people who are being controlled are always going to try to resist, and they're going to use violent means of their own. So, quote, Niebuhr says, society is in a perpetual state of war. And he traces this whole set of ideas about original sin back to the famous Christian theologian Augustine, way back in the Roman Empire times. He says, Augustine concludes that this world is made up of injustice, that its ruler is the devil, that its peace is secured by strife. Still quoting Niebuhr, this is a very realistic interpretation of the realities of social life. Now, from my point of view, that's one way of seeing social life. I'll suggest some others before we're done, right? But to Niebuhr, it's the only realistic way to see social life, right? That it's the ruler of this world is the devil, and peace is always secured by strife. So for Niebuhr, reality means endless conflict and violence. To be a realist is to accept and act on this basic premise. And Niebuhr recognized that his theology, his modernized version of original sin, had direct implications for foreign policy. Because he said in the modern world, the most common way that each of us tries to feel bigger, more powerful, more important, is to identify with our nation and to try to get more than other nations, to try to get our nation to be more powerful than other nations. So he said the political scientists who are realists are right. Original sin makes it inevitable that nations will always be in competition and often at war with each other. In the life of nations especially, evil's inescapable, he says. So he says that old social gospel idea, which had been extremely popular, really dominant up until the 1930s, that idea that all nations can learn to live rationally in peace and harmony, he says it just ain't going to happen. Utterly unrealistic. He says in foreign policy, we should not try to pursue absolute goods like peace and justice and love. The best to hope for is that the lesser evil can control the greater evil using violence if necessary, and a true Christian should accept these kinds of compromises and small improvements rather than chase some impossible perfection. He says we should always let the ends justify the means, always be prepared to use some force, and therefore always live in conflict. And here, in effect, he was endorsing the premises of the old Christian just war theory that Augustine had articulated. Now, by the late 30s, Niebuhr was applying his views very specifically to the threat of Nazi Germany, which he thought was the worst of evils. And he was convinced that only power, only violence could stop violence. So he was convinced that Hitler could only be stopped by war. So he criticized the pacifists for evading what he thought was their responsibility to fight the fascist evil with military force. So the political realists of their day were very quick to draw on Niebuhr's theology to support their political views, and realism grew rapidly in influence among the foreign policy elite as they nervously watched the growing power of Germany and Japan. Right? Now, so we have three traditions. Right? We have the Christian humanist tradition, we have the biblical messianic tradition, translated into America's exceptional virtue, America's mission to lead the world to a messianic age, and we have the realist tradition that America must be the strongest power to fight against and stop other more evil powers. I think Franklin D. Roosevelt's great achievement in foreign policy was to combine these three traditions and to, because logically they don't fit together, right? But Roosevelt had this, and his speechwriters had this great talent for taking things that don't really logically fit together and make them sound like they all fit together, right? And what Roosevelt probably really wanted was something like this utopian vision of the Christian humanist and messianic traditions, right? A single harmonious world order based on democratic capitalism and the American way of life. The great commentator Walter Lippmann called it the evangel of Americanism. But Roosevelt was convinced that Germany and Japan had to be utterly defeated to achieve that universal harmony. So he became a realist in the sense that he said, you got to stop them by any means necessary, even firebombing whole cities, even developing an atomic bomb. But he couldn't talk to the American people. No president can talk to the American people in such realist language. The American public, by and large, wants the language of American exceptionalism, wants the language of a war only in terms of America as the ultimate force for perfect goodness, perfect virtue against absolute evil. And of course, this also goes back to a very important biblical precedent, the apocalyptic vision, that the good people, God's people, the chosen people, will have to fight against the forces of the devil. That messianic age, that perfect era can only be achieved after some great final battle between good and evil. And that was generally the way that people talked about World War II. And that became also, of course, the way that people talked about the Cold War. Because the Cold War, in so many ways, drew upon all three traditions. Now, here I'm talking about the early years of the Cold War. People like George Kennan, Dean Acheson, the people who were most influential in shaping Truman's view of the world. They said that George Kennan called Niebuhr, whose theology I've just described, he said Niebuhr was the father of us all, meaning all the foreign policy makers, all the elite, all of Truman's advisors, right? They were all influenced by Niebuhr. Maybe Kennan was exaggerating a little bit, right? But it's interesting that Niebuhr did play such an important role. And they took his writings as a sort of religious seal of approval on their uncompromising realist stance against the Soviet Union. They said, you got to stop the communists, right? They said any intelligent Christian would realize that the world's two superpowers will inevitably fight against each other. No way to avoid it. And a devout Christian would fight on behalf of the vision of democratic capitalism bringing world harmony, right? So by late 1940s, they were creating what historians often call a national security state dedicated to war against communism, right? But you see, the assumptions built into that security state, especially its Niebuhrian assumptions, the assumption of the realists, is that the United States, like any nation, will always face threats. We'll always have to be watching out for evil doers who are out to get us, and always be willing to fight them off when necessary, right? The policy they developed to prevent this was called containment, right? You have to contain the enemy, which means you can't destroy the enemy. You can't, the problem is in a sense, the plot laid out by the apocalypse. The forces of the devil are trying to destroy the forces of good. But in the late 1940s, especially once the Soviets had an atomic bomb, they were not willing to fight an apocalyptic war to destroy the evildoers. The most they could hope for was to contain them. So in effect, what they were saying is that we will always face threats, we will always be insecure, and that's why I think what they really created was a national insecurity state. There was no way to escape from the insecurity. Now, Niebuhr himself pretty soon began to complain that the foreign policy elite had missed his point, right? Because his point was we're all sinners. We are all driven by this impulse to aggrandize ourselves, to do evil, right? But the foreign policy elite of the United States said, no, 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 it's the communists who are the sinners, right? We are the virtuous. We're the chosen people. We're the new Israel. We just want to create a world of rationality and peace and harmony, a kind of a Christian humanist world. Nothing of this is our fault. We're the exceptional people, American exceptionalism. And so the only way they could talk to the public to raise support for their Cold War effort was to use that kind of language, right? That we Americans are the pure, the virtuous. Now, Niebuhr protested that his ideas were being used wrongly to justify a kind of self-righteousness that he really opposed. He wrote a book called The Irony of American History in the early 50s. He said, you know, the U.S. has always claimed that its mission is to purify the world of sin, but it often acted sinfully. Right? In its effort to protect the free world, the U.S. often perpetrated injustices as bad as those it was opposing. In the last years of his life, he criticized the Vietnam War as the worst example of U.S. intentions gone awry. But it was too late. Niebuhr's words had helped to set in motion political changes that he could not control. His own theory predicts that reason and humility will always be overwhelmed by human passions. The only real limit to the destructiveness of social conflict is the limit set by the state of destructive technology. And of course, the Cold Warriors were quick to build up destructive technology through the hydrogen bomb to unimaginable levels. And Eisenhower became president, and he pretty much agreed with the same view. agreed with containment, agreed that people are innately selfish, right? That the communists would always try to conquer us. But Eisenhower was the first president who said very publicly that this is going to go on for as long as we can foresee. It's really a permanent state of affairs. One of his White House aides wrote a memo that says, being on our guard against the communists, fighting the communists is the new normal. Right? We will always be in this state of insecurity. And maybe it's just a coincidence that shortly after September 11, 2001, Vice President Dick Cheney said that the war on terror was now the new normal. So we've never really escaped from this state of national insecurity. Our war against evil, which before the 1940s was considered just something we did very occasionally, has become a permanent state of affairs because of this convergence of these three traditions that I've outlined for you on the handout there. And we've never escaped from the influence of Niebuhr. When Barack Obama received the Nobel Prize, here's what he said. He said, "Make no mistake, evil does exist in the world. To say that force may sometimes be necessary is not a call to cynicism, it's a recognition of history, the imperfections of man, and the limits of reason. We make mistakes and fall victim to the temptations of pride and power and sometimes evil. Even those with the best of intentions will at times fail to right the wrongs before us." Obama could have been quoting directly from Niebuhr. In fact, he probably was. He's a very careful student of Niebuhr, right? He was certainly reinforcing the basic premise of U.S. foreign policy for the last 3/4 of a century. We're constantly at war with evil, so we must live in a permanent national insecurity state. Now, sometimes, certainly Obama looks to the tradition of Christian humanism. He tries to build support for rational negotiation rather than confrontation. He was forced to do this with Syria. It looks like perhaps he's going to do this with Iran. But when it comes to fighting the terrorists, he is a hardcore Niebuhrian. You know, they are the evildoers, and the only thing we can do is go out and kill them before they kill us. Right? Now, Reinhold Niebuhr often described the human condition as tragic. He said, it's really a tragedy. He said, it's a damn shame. We're always going to be insecure. There's nothing we can do about it. Right? But I would say that the tragedy is not some unalterable human condition. The tragedy is that this particular description of human life has become so pervasive in our society that most of what I've said to you about Niebuhr's views sounds to you, probably a lot of you, like common sense. Or at least it sounds to most Americans like common sense, because for 3/4 of a century, we've been locked into this one way of seeing the world. Right? But the fate of Niebuhr's writings, which led to results that he did not approve, shows that any words that describe human life and human society will help to create the kind of life, the kind of society that they describe. Right? So we're not really stuck in our state of insecurity. Right? That state arose from choices that people made in the way they talked and acted, and we're always free to choose different words that will lead to different policies and different actions. And in the last few minutes, I want to suggest to you that there's another way that we can look to the Christian tradition as a resource for a very different way of looking at foreign policy. And here, I think, our great guide is Martin Luther King, whose words offer us much more than we've really taken advantage of. As a guide, we don't often think of King, perhaps, as a guide to foreign policy. But if you look at all his speeches and sermons, he had a lot to say about how the United States should use its power in the world. What was radical about King is that he looked to this fourth tradition of Christianity, the tradition of nonviolence, the tradition of Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount. Right? But he understood even more deeply than this, and I think this came from his reading of Gandhi. That the basic premise of nonviolence is not merely just, oh, be nice to other people, don't hurt other people. No. The basic premise is, in his famous words, that we are all caught in an inescapable network of mutuality tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever happens to one of us happens to all of us. In other words, we're all related to each other in so many different ways. We all affect each other. We're all part of one organic whole. And from this perspective, many of the familiar assumptions of U.S. foreign policy for the last 3/4 of a century just wouldn't make any sense. From the perspective of nonviolence, it just doesn't make sense to say, oh, some people are purely good, purely innocent, purely virtuous, other people are totally evil. You know, as if we Americans could stand apart from all the evil in the world. If we're all part of a single garment of destiny, we all share responsibility for whatever happens in the world, both the good and the evil. So the enemy can't be any particular person or group of people. The real enemy to fight is the evil that's arisen from all of us together. Yes, America will still have opponents, but our opponents, abroad and at home, are the people who promote inequality and injustice, which does harm to others and also harms themselves. But nonviolence says we oppose their actions. We might even label the actions as evil, but we never label the people as evil. Instead, we treat them as equally important threads in the single garment of destiny. We respect everyone's inherent dignity. We demand the same freedom and justice for them as for all others. No matter what they've done, we recognize that their actions arise from the single garment of destiny, from the global situation. And we want the best for them, as well as for ourselves. Now, we should resist their actions, but we do it only because we want the best for everyone. We will aim to help our opponents fulfill their full potential because that's the only way we can fulfill our full potential. You know, John Quincy Adams once said that America goes not abroad in search of monsters to destroy. But from the viewpoint of nonviolence, there are no monsters. As soon as we start to imagine that some people are monsters and think about destroying them, we destroy the possibility of global community. So we destroy the chance of fulfilling our own highest potentials. So as Dr. King said, America, like any nation, will flourish best if it shows what he called an overriding loyalty to mankind as a whole. America, like every nation, will preserve its own best values only if it helps others enhance their own. And this is rooted in Christian teaching, just as much as the Niebuhr's realist view is rooted in Christian teaching. And I think King taught us that since we and our opponents are parts of the same human family, we have to give them the same respect, the same empathy and love we give our own family members, even when we disagree with them. Yes, we assert our own views, sometimes strongly, because we want the best for everyone, even those we disagree with. So we have to try to see the world through our opponent's eyes. In his words, to see the enemy's point of view, to hear his questions, to know his assessments of ourselves. Only then can we have the fullest view of what is possible for all. And when grave moral matters are at stake, we will take a firm stand and fight for it, but we'll do it nonviolently. Killing or physically harming our opponents can never promote what's best for them. Refraining from physical injury is only part of this larger principle of nonviolence, to love all, to want the best for all, to never intend to do harm to others, never try to gain advantage by imposing ourselves or our views in ways that will thwart the fulfillment of others. Now, it seems to me that the real importance of the nonviolence tradition here is that it avoids the insecurity that is built into the existing narrative of American foreign policy. Right? Because nonviolence says we cannot divide the world into us and them, into the good guys and the bad guys, into America against its enemy. so that it avoids that built-in sense of threat, of danger, of insecurity that is so fundamental in our foreign policy, in our lives now. And it would avoid the impetus to do harm to others, which has so often blown back in harm upon Americans. So the nonviolence tradition, which is so different from Niebuhr's, allows the possibility of escaping from tragedy into a more cooperative, harmonious, and peaceful life. And precisely because it allows for that possibility, it could make genuine security more possible. Now, I know the very idea of the United States basing its foreign policy on Martin Luther King's ideas of nonviolence probably seems totally far-fetched, maybe even impossible. But let me remind you again that in the mid-1930s, the idea that the United States would feel responsible for resisting evil around the world, the idea that that would be the mission of the United States, seemed equally impossible. Right? The idea that we would feel constantly insecure, constantly feel threatened by enemies, in the mid-1930s, that seemed just impossible. But merely a decade later, it seemed the norm. It was the new normal. It took less than a decade for that total transformation of U.S. foreign policy to happen. Transformations can happen that quickly if we want them to. We can never predict the future, so it pays to be open to all possibilities, even those that now seem impossible, and to remember that in the end we are free to have whatever kind of foreign policy we want, if we're willing to do what it takes to turn our highest hopes into reality. Thanks very much, and now I'll be happy to hear what you have to say. Sir, maybe you should stand up.
The difference between your number 1, Christian humanism,
Yeah.
and your number 4, Christian nonviolence, they seem to be very similar.
They are similar. Thank you. That's a very perceptive question. Excuse me. I think the difference, philosophically, let me repeat. He asked, what's the difference between Christian humanism and nonviolence? I think the main difference philosophically is that Christian humanism starts out with the assumption that society is a collection of separate individuals, and that through rational education and rational thinking, I will figure out that I need to be nice to you so that you'll need to be nice to me. It's a sort of a social contract theory. Nonviolence starts out with the premise that we are all already parts, threads in that single garment of human destiny, that we're all already interconnected. We don't have to figure out how to relate to each other. We're already interrelated whether we like it or not. And the policies that may flow from that are somewhat different. The other main difference, I think, is in practice. When we look at 20th century and today's nonviolence, the nonviolence of Gandhi and King, they certainly wanted us to use education and reason as far as it would go. But here, it's also important to remember that King was a very careful student of Niebuhr as well. And King concluded from studying Niebuhr, he said, there's going to be a certain point, I shouldn't say not only from studying Niebuhr, King concluded from growing up as a black man in the South in the 1940s, right, 30s and 40s. He said, there's a certain point at which education and rationality just aren't going to cut it. And you're going to have to take a stand. Right? And you're going to have to take that stand, and as Gandhi said, you're going to have to be willing to die, take the risk of dying if you're going to make social change. And the real challenge is to be able to accept the risk of death without, and still love your enemies. The Christian humanists never got that far, I think. Ma'am.
Question, could you help us to put into context the collective consciousness that went into, say, the creation of the United Nations at that time? And then maybe the role of the U.S. with Israeli-Palestinians at the moment?
You know what? As it turns out, what I'm presenting to you now is my main academic work. I'm a Jewish American for the last 30, 40 years. I have been, as a private citizen, writing and speaking actively for peace between Israel and Palestine. That's a separate issue. And I love this place, and I love Phoenix so much. Let me just ask you to invite me back again to talk about that another time. Okay? But no, but the United Nations. Okay. A very important question. And here the evidence is absolutely clear-cut. Right? Franklin Roosevelt's idea was that the only way to create peace in the world after World War II, he said, maybe 25 years, maybe 50 years, we can guarantee the peace. That was the best he hoped for. He was that much of a realist, is to have what he called the four policemen run the world. The United States, Britain, the Soviet Union, and China, and then he threw in France at the very end. That's why they're the permanent members of the Security Council. He said, okay, we'll have a General Assembly so the little nations can blow off steam. But it's really the Security Council. It's really the big four, the big five that are going to run the world. And he was enough of a Christian humanist to believe that he could get along with Stalin. A very important new book by a very prominent historian, Frank Castigliola, argues this the best recent book on FDR argues this very persuasively, that FDR thought he could get along with Stalin. What happened was FDR died, right? A new group of policymakers came in who were much more Niebuhrian, much more realist, much more suspicious of the Soviet Union. So that's what Roosevelt thought the United Nations was going to do. That's the quick answer, at least, okay? Yes, sir.
How does the American exceptionalism fit into White Man's Burden and Manifest Destiny, which preceded this period?
Very easily, shall I say. Very well. Yes, certainly it was not until very recently, unfortunately. Excuse me one second. When you teach for a long time, you get used to blowing your nose in front of a bunch of room full of people. Until very recently, all of this, everything I've been talking about, this was all language by, for, and about white people, right? And, but here, actually, the Christian humanist tradition probably plays the biggest role. The sense that we, well, I mean, basically, it's hard to say, but it's true, so I think it needs to be said, that until really the 1960s, right, there was a pervasive assumption among white people in this country that white people are simply more rational than people of color, right? And that it was the responsibility of the white people to educate the people of color. That's why Roosevelt was willing to continue colonialism for a short time. He knew colonialism was a disaster. But he said, but these people aren't ready to govern themselves. We have to educate them. That's the same old theory. And so part of our virtue, part of our chosen mission is to educate. Very similar to the French notion of the civilizing mission, the British notion of the white man's burden. You know, that was pretty pervasive throughout the white Western world. Is that a good, quick answer to your question?
Niebuhr a lot.
Oh, yeah.
It's the history foundation of the United States.
Right, but I think maybe what's worth saying here, and these things get so complicated, is that in the 19th century, that was considered a very optimistic view, you know? That we are going to, so it's the same way we treated the native people, right? Beginning with Ulysses Grant, right? That we're not going to kill them. We're going to educate them. We're going to civilize them. We're going to bring them somehow into this harmonious community, right? And Niebuhr's revolutionary move was to come along and say, you can do some of that, but you got to face the fact that ultimately they're going to fight back. Ultimately, you're going to have to dominate them. That was the new view that he brought along that, that became the basis of realism. And it was in the process of merging those traditions together that this predominant view of American foreign policy, fitting all the, as I said, these pieces that don't fit together logically. And yet, yesterday I was talking about using the word mythology, that in a sense what we're really talking about here is American myths. I suppose here I should stop to put in a little plug. I have a blog now called Mythic America. You can Google on it, Mythic America. And I develop a lot of these ideas, saying that these narratives, they function as myths, which don't mean that they're lies. But these are the stories we tell. They're blends of truth and fiction that allow us to make sense out of the world. Now, sometimes we make sense out of the world in ways that really hurt other people really badly. And I wish we had, but Martin Luther King's story was also in a certain sense a myth, in the best sense of that word, right? A narrative that created a sense of meaning that could allow people to interpret in a positive way, from my point of view, all the various complexities of the world. Okay, I'll stop there and ask for other questions. Are there people who have had their hand up for a long time and I haven't seen them? Please.
Yeah, Edward Said's revolutionary book on Orientalism
Yes.
changed the term of it being a white man's Western interpretation of the Orient, the Eastern culture.
Yes.
So would U.S. foreign policy today, like what we have in Afghanistan or in the situation of Israel and Palestine, could that be a direct influence of, let's say, European colonialism?
Oh, sure.
Way when?
Oh, sure.
And how could it relate to that? Like, and the notion of
Niebuhr. Niebuhr?
Niebuhr's
Yes.
idea of us having this fear of the evil in that.
Yes.
part of
Well,
the world.
but I think again, it mixes in with this obviously prejudicial, from my point of view, bigoted notion that we Westerners are more rational, right, and must educate those Orientals, right? And Niebuhr then saying, but you know, they're not going to be very happy about it, right? And they're going to resist your efforts. And that's just the way it is. And then the realist policymakers saying, well, then we better fight back against them. Because if we don't, they're going to overwhelm us. They're going to do terrible things to us, right? So when you start with that premise of a hierarchy of peoples and races, right, and then you add in this fear that Niebuhr's thinking generates, that they're always out to get you, right, then you end up with this permanent state of insecurity. Yeah.
That rationale, could it have come from Christian humanity?
Yes.
Where
Yes,
we're trying to send missionaries to other parts of the world.
In a perverse sort of way, yes.
Yeah.
And in fact, the missionary movements in the late 19th century, yeah, all over the world, were very important. Yes, ma'am.
The Spanish came through, and of course in 1540 claimed all the land west of what is now Dodge City. Then they later came in the 1600s, I believe, and built the Catholic churches on top of the pueblos. And then, we'll grant it back, this Frisco, all Acoma, Baca land grant, which I own land in, and in southern Colorado. Then they land granted it back to the Pueblo Indians. Isn't that wonderful?
Well, now here, to give Niebuhr his due, I'm generally critical of the influence of Niebuhr, but to give him his due, I said he wrote this famous book called The Irony of American History. And he would point out all sorts of things like that, right? That we did all these things in the name of the exceptional purity and virtue of America that were really, from his point of view, pretty sinful. And there's an irony to it, no doubt. Let me ask you again if there are people with their hand up for a long time that I've missed. Okay, please.
Yeah, so my sort of overarching question here is about secularism in relation to this story, and in effect the sort of secularization of institutions of governance in the 20th century as governments get big. So I mean, it strikes me one of the things that's very interesting about your story is the way in which the possibility of universality and a kind of universal rationality figures in by virtue of a kind of theological construction of human persons as such, and thereby displaces in some respects sovereignty as the relevant, and maybe culture, as the relevant kind of unit of analysis for thinking about people. It seems to me relevant that at this moment imperial nations are off sending anthropologists to study the different types of peoples that they're governing in order to figure out how to govern those people differently than themselves. Okay. So it seems to me that the foreign policy, that governance writ large in the 20th century aspires towards this kind of universality and this project of rationality. The social gospel is predicated on the idea that we can know stuff about society and act upon it in order to perfect it.
Right.
So I wonder if you could say something about the theological, what it means to have these theological inflections, what they lose by virtue of the move from Niebuhr to decision theory in realist IR, which seems to have continuity but also profound discontinuity. And then also what this means for the project of human rights, which seems to me to be somewhat consonant with your invocation of nonviolence, as itself a negation of, or a bracketing of sovereignty and culture to some degree, as a sort of relevant anthropological.
Wow, those are two big questions. You want to pick the one that matters?
The first one, although
First one. So you're asking what may be lost in the transition from a traditional religious expression of these themes into their secular version. It's hard to say because it depends on the power structures. When these traditions were being promoted by the Roman Catholic Church in the 15th century, when the Roman Catholic Church essentially, had so much power in Europe, they had a lot of clout. If they're being promoted by churches today, the churches are not the most powerful institutions. And so I think maybe part of it is a question of the time frame. But I don't know, because it's quite honestly, it's a very perceptive question I never thought about. There's I'm just going to say I need to think about that, and I really appreciate the question. I'm just not sure. Yes, ma'am.
Much simpler view on this. Last night I stayed up way too late watching a movie that concludes with the beginning of, the attack on Pearl Harbor. So you're speaking of the 40s. I mean, it's so dramatically expressed that way with how we got attacked, how the United States got attacked, and that changing our future. So, and I thank you for the thing about all this about Niebuhr, because I'm embarrassed to say I didn't know too much about his writing before. So when he was affecting people, I don't even know where he was writing or speaking or who was it only a very high-class elite that was reading him versus, or how can we, I guess my main question is, how can we promote the ideas of the nonviolence, the Martin Luther King kinds of ideas, or at least some of those speeches are more embedded in our broad cultural conscience.
We had a seminar in this room yesterday where we wrestled with that question for about an hour and didn't come to any conclusions. But I will say, the way that religious ideas work, what we call theology, is that they are usually generated by professors in seminaries where ministers, priests, rabbis are trained. And then the ministers, priests, and rabbis take those ideas from their teachers in the seminaries. Or after they're out of seminary, they continue reading the journals in which those professors are writing their articles. And the ministers and priests and rabbis try to simplify those ideas and put them into their sermons and communicate them to their congregations. And I think it's important to remember that there is a tremendous potential for social and political change in the churches and the synagogues and the mosques of this country. And I say that partly because my wife, who was kind enough to accompany me here, works precisely in that area of community organizing for social and political change based in religious congregations. And it's an enormous movement. What do you estimate, about 1 million people now or more? At least 1 million people who are members of congregations that are formally dues-paying members of community change organizations around the country, right? And so there is a way in which new ideas that are generated in seminaries, in universities, in academic settings, can filter down. And not only through clergy people, but through people like you, right? That I hope that now, some of you pick up some new ideas in not only today, but in all the meetings that the center sponsors here. I suspect many of you are probably members of religious congregations, but even if you're not, you go out and talk to people. And I think that's the way these ideas spread. There is this more formal chain through the religious institutions, which is very important. And then there's the more informal change. And there's also this whole network of, I don't know if they had many think tanks back then. Now we have our think tanks, right? And we have our media, right? Ideas spread in hundreds of different ways. But I think because we're talking about religion here, the particular institutional mechanism of from the academic religious thinkers to the clergy and to the educated lay people. I shouldn't just say clergy. I think no doubt some of you read these journals and these newsletters that come from your religious institutions where new ideas come out, and then you talk to your friends and neighbors about them, and gradually, and it's a mysterious process. As I said, ultimately, as much as we might be able to explain about how was it that the assumptions of U.S. foreign policy changed so radically between the mid-30s and the mid-40s, I think it's important to say that, we tend to say, oh, well, the Nazis showed up and the Japs bombed Pearl Harbor, and of course we had to fight them. Well, no, we didn't. There were very influential and articulate voices in the United States in 1939, 40, 41, saying we don't have to fight them, and here are the reasons. And they had long and in some ways very cogent reasons, even if you disagree with them. They had their reasons for saying, no, we don't have to fight them. So it was really a battle between two perceptions of what American foreign policy should be about. It was the old way versus the new way. The new way won out, but it didn't have to win out. And ultimately, there's a mystery to it. Can't really say. In the same way, well, anyway, let me leave it at that. Yes, ma'am.
Along the lines of what you're saying about why people argue we did not have to go to war, under some of the nonviolent traditions, the idea is that you are linked with your neighbor. Would it therefore mean like you should come to the aid of your neighbor? Like, okay, England is being quickly conquered by these new powers. We should come to the aid of our neighbors because we are all a community, a human community.
But the key point is that we should do that without inflicting violence on anyone else, right? That's the difficult part. That's the difficult part. And certainly that was not Franklin Roosevelt's idea. his idea was, we send them the planes and the bombs and the torpedoes and all the killing materials that they need. Martin Luther King's idea, Gandhi's idea, was that if we are creative enough and willing to take the risks involved, there are all sorts of ways in which we can come to the aid of other countries in need without inflicting death or physical injury, and even more so, to do it in a spirit of love. See, this is the point, and Gandhi has been widely criticized for this, when he said, yes, you should resist the Nazis, but you should love the Nazis at the same time. And Martin Luther King said, yes, you should resist those vicious white racists, but you should love them at the same time. Love them as your neighbor, because we're all parts of the same human family. That's the challenge. And I don't want to pretend that I can do it. I can repeat the ideas. To actually do it in lived life, that's a different story. But I've seen it done, and it's an extraordinary thing when you see it in action. Yes, ma'am.
Doesn't it really get down to enough people in the world having a vision of what human nature really is? Is it essentially good or is it essentially evil?
Well, actually, Dr. King addressed that question directly. His answer was, it's neither. It's both. Right? That we do not have to assume that people are essentially good. I mean, could he really assume that those white racists who would spit upon his daughter were good?
Isn't that what love means, though?
No,
It isn't
no,
what love means.
no. That's the real challenge of nonviolence, is to say, I don't think those people are essentially good, but they're essentially human, and I love them, right? And I understand that it's not, really, from my point of view, the most constructive move is to set aside that question of human nature and to say their evil actions don't come from any internal nature. Their evil actions come from a society that produces evil, that they're the agents of a society. Now, I know some of you who study genetics will have a very different point of view, perhaps, and that's a whole separate question. But he said, in terms of creating social change, that debate about is human nature good or evil, it really just gets in the way. I think that was his point of view. Yes.
Well, and I think the minute you use the word evil and sin, you put it in a religious context, as opposed to a neurologist or a geneticist talking about different kinds of behaviors.
Yes.
And I was reminded of the article you just posted in Cocoon about the founding fathers and how they had a basic understanding or basic belief that people would do good for their own self-aggrandizement. Could you elaborate on that?
Yeah, I think it wasn't so much for their own self-aggrandizement. This was a piece I've been reading an important, very influential historian's book on the period of the Revolutionary War and the early first years of the United States. And he was saying that there was such a widespread belief back then, it was really that Christian humanist tradition, right? That people had an innate benevolence. And here, we're going back to Thomas Jefferson and his generation, who did have a belief in human nature, that human nature was essentially good. And that if you educated people, you would bring out their fundamental goodness, and that they wouldn't need government to make them be good, right? That they would naturally understand that they should help each other to build a better society. That is an important part of our tradition. And I was pointing out in that article that today's people who are in favor of shrinking the government generally don't realize, when they point back to Jefferson, that that idea goes along with a belief in the basic goodness of human nature. I don't know that we see that so much in the Tea Party. So I thought it was ironic, coming back to irony, right? That,
So do you think that the rise of the more fundamentalist religion is a cause or an effect or co-rose with this new mentality in the 30s?
No, because well, let's say fundamentalist religion as a political force doesn't really appear until the late 70s. It has its seeds in the 60s, but it doesn't really emerge significantly until the late 70s. So that's yet a third lecture I could come back and give. I can keep coming back to Phoenix. As long as it's in the winter, I'll be happy to come back.
Can I just throw something in there? Just might have ideas. Religions of India, going back to Gandhi, and I'm from one of the religions of India, Sikhism, Buddhism. Sikhism, Buddhism, Jainism, Hinduism, born in India. They all, as far as I know, think that each human has the divine and themselves, their ego. And so, life is a battle of the ego over that divinity which is pure. So I just kind of want to throw that out as, perhaps that's what Gandhi was talking about. Because when you love somebody whose actions are perhaps evil, but they still have that divine.
Yeah. I think, excuse me, to put that in an American context, I think Dr. King's way of expressing that was, in the biblical language, we're all children of God, right? And some of us as children of God, in a sense, violate the godliness that is a possibility for us because we're children of God. We don't all act that way, but nevertheless, as I said, even the most vicious racists, from his point of view, are children of God and deserve a fundamental respect and perhaps more importantly, have the potential to rise above their evil deeds. And I don't think, again, because King was influenced by Niebuhr, he didn't shrink away from the word evil. But he only used it to talk about what people do, not what they are. That's an important difference. Okay, let me ask you again, are there people who have had their hand up a long time and feel frustrated? Okay, yes.
Couple of things. You mentioned Henry Luce.
Yeah.
And when he founded his new magazine, I think in 1940, it was actually Henry Luce who coined the phrase, the American century.
Right.
And the American century is ending, if it has not already ended. Not just the American century, but the whole dominance of the West over the rest of the world, being replaced not only by China, but more by Asia. So the new century is likely to be the new Asian.
That's why we're pivoting.
Yeah, that's exactly right. That's why we're pivoting. You mentioned Cordell Hull and his vision for freer trade occurring all over the world. We have free trade agreements with many individual countries. South Korea, Morocco, as an example. We're currently negotiating with the European Union, which has a market of 500 million people, larger than the United States, Canada, and Mexico combined. For instance, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, all the Pacific Rim nations negotiating for freer and freer trade. My question is, where or who are the religious leaders today who can help Americans understand the need for a new foreign policy recognizing this new age of globalization? I think Reverend Wright tried to do it in 2008 when he said the chickens have come home to roost, but that language was a little too inflammatory for Americans to accept.
Yeah.
So who do we have today?
Gosh, wow. I think, let's see, the first name that comes to mind is Jim Wallace, who's important because he's not just a Christian, he's an evangelical Christian. And he's a very progressive evangelical Christian. It's important for us to recognize that there's a growing movement of evangelical Christians who are very progressive in their views on both domestic and foreign policy. And there's a host of such. I have I have a piece that I think is going to come out on Alternet. Any of you read Alternet? It's a good website about the radical roots, just as I wrote about the radical roots of the Tea Party, the radical roots of evangelical Christianity, which has been a force for radical progressive change in this country up through the era of the social gospel, and it's growing, beginning to grow again. Wallace is probably the most famous name. But I want to say more broadly that I think that you've identified the real challenge to this country for decades to come is how do we readjust our foreign policy, our way of talking, thinking about foreign policy, to a world where we're no longer the dominant power. And that's one good reason to look back to Dr. King and the nonviolence tradition, because these other traditions that I've talked about, they worked pretty well when we came out of World War II as by far the dominant power in the world, right? And we're still, so much of our foreign policy is based on the illusion that we still have that dominance. And you're right, and this is going to be because this sense of insecurity is so deeply built into our way of talking about the world. As we continue to relatively lose economic, diplomatic power, not military power, unfortunately, but other kinds of power, we're going to feel more threatened. And it's something I really worry about. It's something I wish I had a better answer for you, but it's something to worry about. Okay, one more question? Okay, you pick the question. Okay.
You've been talking this whole lecture, of course, on foreign policy, and in answering some of the questions and comments that have been made, a lot of them seem to relate to us internally, not just the foreign policy. So I've been trying to take some of your ideas, the three traditions plus the Martin Luther King one, and relate it to America today. Now, have you done that?
Yes.
And if so, can you give it, I mean, I can quickly see some of them. I haven't been sure, maybe you could help on the exceptionalism and relating to internally within our country.
This is almost like a setup for my perfect final question. Because my quick short answer is that coming out of World War II and the early Cold War, we have this deep-seated sense that the world is a frightening place, that we have reason to always be insecure, always on guard, always worried. And what that means is that any kind of fundamental change anywhere in the world looks frightening, right? And I think that that's the deepest root of the long-term conservative trend in this country that we've seen. If we compare today to Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal era, right? We've had this long-term shift to the right, a brief reaction against it in the 60s, but overall long-term shift to the right, right? And I think what I can contribute, there's lots of reasons for that, but what I can contribute to that is this idea that foreign policy carries over into domestic policy in that sense that if the world is such a frightening place, right, that the smartest thing that you can do as an individual is to build some kind of fence or wall around your own private life, right? Keep out all the threats, right? And if you look at conservative movements, what they're really built on is this endless series of threats, the latest of which is big government, you know? And again, that's why I like to talk about mythology. It may not be logical. Myths don't have to be logical, right? But they have to give a sense of meaning to things that are otherwise just sort of random and chaotic. So the story, I think, of conservatism is that the world is a scary place. Anything that looks like it's going to impinge on the orderliness, the security, the safety of you and your family and your small circle of friends or your church or whatever, all right, anything that looks like it's going to impinge on that, you better keep it out. And if we look at all the different causes that American conservatism has taken on, most all of them are about keeping threat away. And I think the roots of that are in this foreign policy development that I've been talking about. So a perfect place to end. Thank you very much.